The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has for decades simmered at the heart of the United Nations, which churned out countless resolutions and speeches, seemingly delivering little peace. The conflict dates back to 1947, when the UN General Assembly proposed the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states and leave Jerusalem as an international city overseen by UN trusteeship. A Palestinian state was never established. But a year later, the State of Israel was created after Zionist forces expelled at least 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and captured 78% of historic Palestine. The UN then established an agency to deal with the resulting refugee crisis while supporting their right to return. But in 1967, Israel captured and occupied the entire territory of historic Palestine, an occupation that continues to this day despite UN resolutions calling it illegal under international law. With each passing decade, as Israel's occupation became more entrenched, doubts increase over the UN's ability to realize a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine.
The problem, of course, with the UN approach in this period is that it appears to be doing what I call managing the occupied Palestinian territory through a humanitarian approach, rather than looking at it and analyzing it through an emancipatory sort of framework.
As new countries joined the UN, the Palestinian issue became a significant point of contention between the Security Council and the General Assembly.
From the beginning, the General Assembly had individual rights and self-determination rights front and center. That whole agenda and structure has been defeated at the Security Council again and again and again.
That's because the power of imbalance between the two governing UN bodies. All member states in the General Assembly have an equal vote, but it only takes one among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to defeat any resolution with a veto. And the United States has used that veto power more than 30 times to shield Israel against UN action. Now the General Assembly has put the issue of Israel's illegal occupation before the UN's highest court for its advice. But any opinion will be non-binding, so it's unclear if it will have any effect. Axel Zamovich, Al Jazeera.
Marwan Bishara is Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. So Axel was just talking about the role of the United Nations in all of this that has been going on. It was the UN General Assembly back in 2022 that had referred this case to the International Court of Justice. The ruling is not going to be for another 5 or so months, but at that point, the UN will then have to decide what it's going to do with that ruling. How significant do you think that's going to be? Is there a way of envisaging what might happen there, depending on the ruling?
You know, it's actually, the ruling goes beyond the United Nations and beyond the General Assembly and what it could not do, because the best the UN General Assembly can do is probably issue another resolution that's also would be non-binding. So I think the importance here is both legal, moral, and political. And it's important because since 2022 on today and the next few years, there is a real attempt on the part of the United States, the world superpower and the leading power in the region, to keep framing and reframing the problem and the solution beyond and above international law. It doesn't address international law. Notice, for example, I think our viewers around the world, I'm sure have noticed that over the past several years, every time the Americans talk about even the best case scenario, a Palestinian state, they never talk about ending the occupation. For some reason, occupation is the problem. Occupation, it's the occupation stupid, right? And really, this is all what this is about. I mean, what has been said over 3 hours? It's the occupation stupid. It's the occupation that's the source of all evil. It's also, the occupation is the source of the conflict, not the conflict is the source of occupation. Because again, we've been saying for years now, for decades, that there is an Arab-Israeli conflict. But there is no Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's an Israeli occupation of Palestine. There's an Israeli colonization of Palestine. There's an Israeli theft in Palestine. There's an Israeli apartheid in Palestine. There's Israeli violence, racism, expropriation of land, denial of freedom, denial of the right of self-determination in Palestine, all coming out of this occupation, right? And dispossession, of course. So there is no Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There is an Israeli aggression, there is Israeli occupation, and now there's Israeli siege and genocide. Hence, reframing the problem to its original framework, that there is an aggression going on against the Palestinian people, is key. And hence, for the court to be able to once again underline the fact that there's nothing temporary about this, that this is a permanent occupation, been going on for almost 6 decades. It has turned into annexation. It's illegal.
This is non-binding. And as a result, there's a lot of speculation that Israel is unlikely to adhere to any ruling that the ICJ puts out. Now, I know that back in 2004, the ICJ issued a ruling about the separation wall that Israel was building. And again, if anything, the separation wall has increased and the building projects have continued. Now, I know that Benjamin Netanyahu wrote about this at the time in, I think it was the New York Times. You also wrote about it at the same time. Tell us about what your response was to his argument that the ICJ didn't have any jurisdiction and that the separation wall was only a temporary measure.
Actually, at the time, it was the International Herald Tribune, which became the New York Times. New York Times was part owner. And both articles came out in the same day after the ICJ ruling that the wall was illegal, right? So in fact, believe it or not, at the time, the New York Times then, the editors, put my article on top, Benjamin Netanyahu's article below. My article was, the wall is illegal, right? It's an apartheid wall. It's a wall that meant for separation, meant to maintain Israel's control over the West Bank, and so on and so forth. Netanyahu then came with the idea that, no, this is not illegal, that this is self-defense. Now, what we know from the ICJ ruling back in 2004, it said basically, and really very so importantly, that Israel had no such right of self-defense in an occupied territory. That any such right of self-defense, as Israel claims it, will perpetuate Israel's occupation. And once again, that's what we've been talking about today and what we talked about back in 2004. And that's the importance of the ICJ ruling, is that occupation is self-perpetuating, that it creates a system of violence. It leads in return to resistance. Resistance leads to retaliation by the occupation, and so on and so forth, as we've seen in Gaza today, leading basically to genocide. At the time, Netanyahu said the wall is temporarily. Of course, it's been 20 years. And if anything, it's becoming ever more de facto in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now that we've seen the number of illegal settlers more than triple since then, since 2004. So Israel is turning its temporary occupation into permanent annexation. In fact, Israel's leaders today are far more outspoken, as we've heard today in the case made against Israel occupation by the Palestinian team, that Israeli leaders are more and more boastful of their annexation.
Marwan, as always, thank you very much indeed. Marwan Bishara, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst.